Hello and welcome back to Ethics and Philosophy. And this week in Module 2, we're going to ask ourselves a very simple question. Why should we be moral? And in the second half of Module 2, we will look at cultural relativism, which kind of tests the question, why should we be moral, by giving it a kind of universal perspective. Now, we started last week with some pretty difficult subject matters. We looked at three cases that were particularly hard to kind of fathom out because it seemed like both sides had the right answer. And this is the dilemma with ethics and morality, that it's not right and wrong, but in fact, two rights. And we try to figure out which is the right one, which is the right action to follow through with. And as you probably remember from last week, all three cases were quite different. In the case of baby Teresa, we had the parents that had a kind of utilitarian perspective on this otherwise tragic situation, and they wished to harvest their daughter's organs, knowing full well that she would not survive. And Florida law, even the hospital was on the side of the parents, but Florida law said, no, you cannot harvest the organs of a person after you have intentionally killed them, which was the situation that we were facing. So here, as much as the parents wished to be utilitarian about their loss, they couldn't. Now, Jody and Marie, a different situation where the hospital was able to override the parents' wishes to keep the conjoined twins intact. So the hospital here was utilitarian, and the parents were ethicists, we'll say. We'll get into these terms later. And then finally, the last tragic case of Tracy Latimer. Her father is the one that was kind of looking for the greater good, right, which is what utilitarianism is, and decided to euthanize his daughter because he felt that she was suffering far too much. So three cases, three very different and difficult cases, but the same positions are taken, but from different perspectives. In other words, different people are choosing these particular things. So this is what I want to look at for this week is why should we even consider these particular changes and these positions? So what are we asking ourselves to consider and to do? We want to make sure that it's morally right to respect people's lives and property, for sure. We should not use people as a means to an end. We shouldn't enslave others to get them to do our bidding. That's just not morally or ethically right. We should also think that it's morally right to tell the truth and to help people. I don't know if you noticed, but hopefully you did click on some of the articles that I posted from last week. Three articles that surprisingly all came out within a day or so of each other that had to do with lying. And when people lie to one another, they manipulate each other with words and with language. That's also unethical. Because imagine a society where everyone was allowed to lie. That society would start to fall apart pretty quickly. That very thin veneer, that thin tissue that holds us together would tear apart very quickly if people willingly and consciously lie to one another. You wouldn't trust anybody, right? You wouldn't trust if someone would stop at a red light and you go to cross the street and they're on the way to work, they don't care, boom, they run you down. So telling the truth, helping people, respecting one another is all part of what is considered morally right or ethically right. But the question is still there, right? Why should I care about doing what is right? What is it about that I should even think seriously about? Well, for the reasons that I've just pointed out, if we don't, the first thing that goes is society and what we typically call society's rules, right? The rules and regulations that we need to abide by in order for society to continue to exist. Because society is not a thing, right? It is a kind of institution, but ultimately it is an idea. And it is an idea that's under threat constantly. Just like democracy is perhaps an institution in the abstract, but ultimately it's an idea. And that idea can be attacked and dismantled very, very quickly. So when it comes to something like society and the glue that holds it together, much of that has to do with ethical and moral behavior. Now, it used to be for hundreds of years that religion was the glue that held everything together. So let's take a look at that and see how we've transitioned from that kind of world where religion played an important part in everyday life to the position that we find ourselves in now, which is considered a secular world. Okay, so our idea of living rightly, is what we used to call it, consisted in obeying God's commands. So whether it is God, Allah, or whatever figurehead that you follow, that figurehead set out the rules and regulations by which we should live properly and well and righteously. You can call it the Ten Commandments, you can call it a code of life, whatever it may be. And the idea, of course, was that if you followed through, there would be a very good chance that you would end up in something resembling heaven or some kind of utopia or nirvana. So if we followed the rules, we would not be punished. Pretty simple, right? So what happens here is we're looking at a commandment that is now broadcasted to us by a deity, by a Godhead. And this Godhead is saying that something is wrong simply because they say so. So it's saying that something is wrong. Just the fact of saying it makes it wrong. Do not steal. Do not kill. All these things are commandments that are given to us by a Godhead that we follow. Now, even if we live in a secular world, let's not kid ourselves, the foundation of the legal system in North America and Western Europe, for large part, is built on the foundation of the Ten Commandments. That's why we call it a Judeo-Christian world. So the commandments are there, and they undergirth, or they create the foundation for a legal system. But again, there are smaller things, jaywalking, lying sometimes, telling a white lie, which don't really bend the rules, because if no one's watching or no one gets hurt, we typically look at something like that and go, well, it's not going to harm anybody. I can kind of just bend the rules a little bit. But his saying that something is wrong makes it wrong, and these are the major commandments. So this is what I want to look at and see exactly what's going on here. What we're talking about here is what's called a divine commandment theory. So what is that? That is, an action is morally right if, and only if, it is commanded by a Godhead. But the question becomes, how do we know what the Godhead commands? Right? We can only know of these Godheads, of these entities. We don't know them intimately or intuitively. We just know of them. So we have to kind of trust that what they're saying is in fact correct. So whatever scripture you follow, the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, whatever church tradition that you follow, if this is where you are getting your morality from, typically this does not involve questioning the validity of these statements, the validity of these commandments. But this is kind of what we're doing right now. We're asking, okay, how exactly is this working? Because this world of ethics and world of morality that we talk about, as you can see in this diagram here, overlaps a whole range of things. So ethics has to do with rules and regulations of an everyday life in society, our moral values, how we look into things, the moral principles that we follow, the ethical practices. Remember last week I mentioned the difference or the relationship between morality and ethics. Morality are the value systems that we have inside our heads that are given to us by our community, our parents, our religious affiliations, and in our ethical practices are the expressions of these value systems that we have to do good by one another, right? To trust one another, to not lie to one another, to respect one another. So the rules of conduct, regulations, practices all stem from ethics, which are the expressions of a moral system. Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? And it is, for the most part. And of course, along comes Socrates. Of course, he's writing, let's say 2,400 years ago. So these questions have been around for a very, very long time. And the question is this. Socrates says, okay, if we were to kind of weigh these things, these commandments, now, of course, Socrates is writing and discussing, no, actually not writing because he never wrote anything. He just discussed, if we believe Plato, Socrates discussed the idea that, look, either the gods have good reasons for their instructions, commandments, if you wish, or they don't. And if we don't, then those commandments may be just arbitrary and subjective. Now, that sounds maybe sacrilegious or heretical or at least shocking. But remember, too, that at the time that Socrates is writing, the gods that we're talking about here, or at least that Socrates is talking about, are the ones that belong to mythology. These would be the Zeus and Hera and Athena and Diana and Demeter, and all these other gods and goddesses, this whole pantheon of individuals who, let's face it, if Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey are anything to go by, weren't exactly stellar citizens. They weren't exactly, the best of the bunch, we'll say. So for Socrates to ask that question was not a matter of being an atheist or being blasphemous. He's asking what would have been a relatively normal question. Either these gods have good reasons for telling us these things, or they don't. And if they don't, then those commandments may be just arbitrary. So it kind of asks us to think in the following way. If the gods do have good reasons for their instructions, then there must be some standard of rightness that is independent of the commandment itself. And that independence has to do with that relationship that I mentioned in the previous slide about this Godhead, this entity, says something is wrong that makes it wrong because they said so. And so the rightness or wrongness of an action can be understood simply as, well, the God said so, right? Do not kill, do not cheat, do not steal. These are things that, for the most part, are objective commandments that we should all follow. But Socrates goes a little bit further. He's asking us to consider these commandments, whether they are right or wrong. And for the most part, even back in ancient Athens, lying was not a good thing, and certainly was picked up by the Bible as something that is important. And so if we lie to one another, we not only threaten our relationships with one another, but those relationships together constitute that social fabric, right? That is thin and always stretched to its breaking point. We don't want to break it any further. So look, lying is wrong, not because the Bible necessarily says so, or whichever book you read, the Torah or the Quran. It's bad because it causes harm, right? It's bad because it violates that trust that we need to place in one another in order for things to kind of happen. So if that's the case, then maybe independently of the Godhead, those commandments may actually be pretty useful, right? Because they do help society to carry on. So we can formulate this issue in a different way if we consider it this way. Okay, so is something right because that Godhead commands it? Or does God or Allah command it because it is right? So if you look at those two statements, which one of them is more arbitrary, right, and more subjective? Well, it turns out that the first one has the possibility, right, the likelihood that it could be arbitrary and subjective. Something is right or wrong because that figurehead commands it. Or the more objective and sort of not arbitrary is the second one, right? Does God or Allah command it because it is right? In and of itself, the statement is good. Lying is a bad thing. Stealing and killing is a bad thing. Anything that threatens the fiber of society is a bad thing, regardless of who says it. And that's ultimately what we're getting at here. So, can morality or ethics exist without a Godhead? And this was the issue that was facing, the world, but primarily Western Europe, which is unfortunately the bias that we have in most of the philosophy that we are going to look at in this course. I would argue that certainly no matter where you look, whether Islamic philosophy or Eastern philosophy, the same issues do come up because these issues are important and they're perennial because society requires that people not lie to one another, not kill one another, not steal from one another, or use each other as a means to an end in order for society to function. So I would say that probably no matter where you're looking, this idea is going to come up. So the commandment is stated by a Godhead because it is already a good thing. So can morality and ethics exist without a Godhead? And this is essentially what we're going to ask. Short answer is yes. Because by the 1600s, 1700s at the very latest, with the movement started by the Renaissance, and depending where you look in the Renaissance, both geographically and in terms of, whether it's art or science or literature or politics, the Renaissance starts at various times. But within 100 years, the Renaissance is in full swing. And part of that also involves a pushback by science, by literature, by writers, to push back against the iron grip that the church had had on society at this particular point. And so what happens in philosophy, for example, as early as the 1600s, is this idea that the world should become more rational, right? It should become more secular. And it is still possible for a world to be rational and sacred, but the push at this point was because, certainly in Western Europe, the iron grip that the Catholic Church had on Western European political and social institutions was overwhelming. And the idea was philosophers would now start to think about ethics and morality as a human phenomenon, not something that is brought down from on high, 10 Commandments and those kinds of images and metaphors, but something that is specific to human beings. So we should look at ethics as a human phenomenon. And if that is, it is something that we can create. Now, these ideas, although they come into being here kind of in earnest during the 17th century, these kinds of ideas were also present in ancient Athens at the time that Socrates was writing, because democracy and ethics and the relationship between those two institutions was already there, because democracy was something that was brand new at this point. And all those philosophers understood that this thing was a fragile institution that needed to be protected and people needed to believe in it. Now, of course, during the Dark Ages and from about the year, let's say 300 to 1600, the church basically calls the shots and says, we're in charge, you follow what we say, and everything will be just fine. And for a very, very long time, that was exactly the case. But with the push of philosophy and science against the power of the church in the 1600s, and really kind of blooms and blossoms in the 1700s, we had this idea of creating a society that's based on secular thoughts. So this is why. Why would this be important? Well, if you are a history buff, especially Western Europe, the majority of battles and wars and fights were about religion. So philosophy decides one day, the best thing to do is to take that right out of the equation. Take it out of politics, take it out of society, take it out of philosophy. Let's remove these religious biases and prejudices and create a secular world where there will not be, or at least less likely, to be battles based on religious ideology and religious differences. So individuals such as Thomas Hobbes, that we see a picture of here, he's writing during the 1600s, and he comes up with this really kind of almost elegantly simple idea that we're all self-interested creatures. We're self-interested in the sense that we want to have the best for ourselves. So we are self-interested creatures who want to live as well as possible. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we do that by following and believing in a kind of secular ethics. So a kind of secular ethics, not sacred, not based on godheads and divinities, but in fact based on what we as human beings consider to be important. Lying, stealing, cheating, murdering are of course very important, because all of those threaten society, absolutely, democracy for sure, but all these brand new ideas, these new institutions that are being developed in their infancy during this time are now going to be built on this secular foundation. And that's really kind of what's going on here. So ethics arises when people realize what they ought to do if they decide to live well. So that word ought, right, is capitalized and italicized for a reason. Because when we talk about morality and ethics, and especially ethics, what is that? That is the expression of our moral belief system. When we talk about what we can do, right, of course we can cheat. Of course we can lie. And if we need be, maybe we can get away with murder. But we ought not to. What is that doing? It's giving us a choice. Morality and ethics is about making the right choice. And I said at the beginning of this first set of slides here that often it's between two rights. So we ought to do the thing that is best, right? In the best interest of people. That's utilitarianism. And that's where it begins to start. That's where it kind of begins, to come into being as a way of thinking in a secular manner. So very, very important. So Thomas Hobbes, and we'll talk about him in a few weeks when we go back to talking about social contract theory, so of which this is a part of. But Hobbes thought that, you know what, if we can kind of get along with one another and cooperate with one another, likely our lives would be much easier. And generally speaking, that was correct. It was a way of thinking about the world that would be more cooperative rather than confrontational. And we would try to make that society function by making that the basis, making cooperation the basis, living socially, living cooperatively. All these kinds of things would be not only possible, but would be possible if we simply followed simple guidelines, simple rules. So ethics now are not kind of necessarily commandments coming down from on high, from some divine entity, but in fact, just rules, right? That any self-interested person, if they wish to live well, would be able to agree to, providing others obey them as well, right? That's the key. We can go ahead and we can obey them, but we kind of want everybody else to do the same thing. So there is social pressure on individuals to follow these ethical guidelines and these ethical rules. And we still have them. We still have all kinds of rules and regulations that we sort of tacitly agree to. And if we were to make a list of all these things, there's actually quite a lot of stuff that we do without almost even thinking. Whenever we speak to people, for example, we don't sort of get right up on their grill and we stand an inch away from them, unless we wish to threaten them, because that is considered a threatening move on another person. So we have this kind of tacit agreement that the closest we get to people is about maybe 1.5 feet away from them. And again, it's not something that was written down and, we've got to sign off on this before we were even born. No, we learn these things. We learned, when and in what capacity we can tell the truth to people. We don't want to offend people. So there's a whole range of things that we do that are simply ethical rules, that if we follow them, the likelihood is that we are going to live a pretty reasonable life, but we want others to do the same. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Now, why is that important? Why do we wish to follow secular rules and regulations and wish others to do the same thing? Well, we want to because we want to maintain what we are going to talk about in more detail in a few weeks, but what we call the social contract. So that social contract that I certainly didn't sign and you didn't either, that's just what it's called. But what is really kind of attractive about the social contract is not only does it have a secular foundation to these rules and regulations, they're not divine, they're secular. It does three things. The first is that it kind of takes a mystery out of ethics and takes a mystery out of, what should I do? What ought I to do? Rather than worrying about praying and waiting for a response, we just kind of, the rule of thumb, if you want to call it that, is, what will cause the greatest amount of good by my behavior? If I'm going to wear my mask and go outside and socially distance from others, then clearly that's a good thing. If I'm going to take my mask off and get up in their grill and start yelling at them and spitting on them and breathing on them, no, it could likely make someone sick. So it takes a mystery out of ethics. What ought I to do? Well, the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do to you. The greater good, however you want to define it, it really essentially adds up to the same thing. So it takes a mystery out of ethics. 2, it gives us a sensible way to determine what our moral duties are. Anything that increases the amount of sociability between individuals, that strengthens that social fabric that is between ourselves and the family and our neighborhood, our community, our city, our province, our country, and on it goes. Anything that makes social living possible and beneficial is obviously a good thing. And 3, it gives a plausible answer to the following question: why should we behave morally when it is not to our advantage? Well, this is the situation that we are finding ourselves in right now. There have been many freedom protests that we've had both in London, in Toronto, and in Alberta, Manitoba, as people are told to behave in a certain way, the first thing that they start screaming about is, you've curtailed my freedom. Well, all of a sudden now we're realizing that, yeah, we have had a social contract all along, and we look and we sort of judge other people's behaviors being, well, reckless, dangerous, unhealthy, because no, we're being asked to wear masks, stay at home, try to work from home if you can, socially distance when you go outside. Well, that's a small price to pay, because even if we don't catch it, we could be asymptomatic. We could give it to our parents, our grandparents. We could make others ill. We may not suffer, but we could make other people ill. So that's not a good thing. Yet there are people that think that wearing a mask is somehow living in Nazi Germany, which pick up a history book and find out what that really was like. That was the least of their worries. But why should we behave morally when it is not to our advantage? Well, yeah, there will be always some people that are going to try to slip through the cracks and, find loopholes and so on, and expect other people to do, to do the heavy lifting, as they say. But generally speaking, most of us believe that these small sacrifices are for the greater good. That's what matters, right? That's what's more important. So the greater good, if you are a utilitarian, is really what matters in the end. So just here, I'd like to kind of point out some ideas that really kind of go almost 2,000 years in time, where these different philosophers are essentially saying the same thing. For example, Aristotle in his book 1 of the Politics. Every state is a community of some kind, and every community is established with a view to some good. For mankind always acts in order to obtain that which they think is good. But if all communities aim at some good, the state or political community, which is the highest of all and which embraces all the rest, aims at good in a greater degree than any other, and at the highest good. Now, Aristotle was not considered a utilitarian, but certainly his language, his vivid metaphors and his language really set the foundation for utilitarian thinking. This notion of the greater good, obtain that which is good, the highest good of all, and all these, this emphasis on the good. What is best for that community? What is best for that society? So here's Aristotle writing Politics, maybe 325 BC, thereabouts. 425 BC, my mistake. But writing a very long time ago, and yet there's the same idea. David Hume, writing in the 1700s, he came up with this idea of social sentiments. If you're a sociologist, this would be called sociability, but social sentiments, right? Feelings that connect, individuals together. We care about one another, so we have a social sentiment. We worry about our next door neighbor. We want to make sure that we do things that are not going to harm them, because remember, do unto them as you would have them do unto you. So that notion of social sentiment for David Hume is important, because the true interests of mankind lie in this kind of a position, this kind of a perspective on secular ethics. So he writes, quote, "In all determinations of morality, this circumstance of public utility is ever principally in view." So public utility, what is the greatest good? What can we all aspire to do in order to make society function at its highest level? Political institutions, economic institutions, social institutions, whatever we need to do to make those societies function at its highest capacity is considered good. Now, Baron d'Holbach, a French radical Enlightenment thinker, writes in The System of Nature. This would have been 1776, roughly. Again, very similar language to both David Hume, who they were friends, and also Aristotle. To be virtuous, then, is to place his interest in that which accords with the interest of others. Couldn't be any simpler. To place your interest in accords with the interest of others. It is to enjoy those benefits, that pleasure which he himself diffuses over his fellows. He whom his nature, his education, his reflections, his habits have rendered susceptible of these dispositions, and to whom his circumstances have given him to faculty of gratifying them, becomes an interesting object to all those who approach him. If you are a decent person, you will attract and bring out decency in others. That's what D'Holbach is saying. Now, he too was arguing very much for utility, the greater good. And D'Holbach is writing at a point in French society in the late 1700s when the church still has a stranglehold on society. And D'Holbach is saying, look, please, for the love of God, if you want, ease off a little bit. Allow individuals to discover for themselves these secular ethics, because this is at a point where the church is vastly, incredibly wealthy, almost obscenely wealthy, and there's abject poverty in French society. And yet the church is telling these otherwise poor people who can't afford anything, please give to the church, buy your way into heaven. Don't resist. This is your life. And when you die, you'll go to a better place. And D'Holbach and the rest of the radical French Enlightenment are going, okay, these people are literally dying at your feet, dying at the doorstep of the church. And you're saying, it's all good. It's all good. There's got to be another way. And that other way was secular ethics. So that's kind of where this is coming from. So I've talked a little bit about utilitarianism, which is one of two main positions. And we'll look next week at the other one that's presented by Immanuel Kant. But here I want to talk about utilitarianism, which is in ethics and morality, one of two main positions. And it's the idea of the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. Now notice it's not 100% good, 100% people. The greatest good implies that the majority of people are going to benefit from that action. So when a political institution declares war, when a country declares war on another country, there will be people that some will sign up, will do this willingly, but we know there's going to be bloodshed. People will lose their lives for some greater good, which is nationhood or freedom or democracy or whatever it may be, bragging rights even, we don't know. But a war always will have suffering. And so the greatest good is that the majority of people will be able to be the beneficiaries of a particular country winning a war. So we can have, nationhood and freedom and all the rest of it, but people will have died in trying to support and protect these particular institutions. So when we talk about the greatest good, it's not 100%. It's always the majority of people. So this is the position that both Hume and D'Holbach talk about. We are going to try to do something very simple. Produce the greatest possible benefits for everyone who will be affected by our actions. So the principle of utility is very simple, and it combines three ideas. One, it determines what we should do. We should always be guided by our actions, not our thoughts, not our emotions, our opinions, our impulses. We need to be guided by our actions. So it is an action-based perspective. What can I do to make this better? First. Second, to determine which consequence is the best, we should care only about the benefits and harms it would cause to others. So as we are weighing our options, and as we are doing that, we're weighing different actions. So we look at the consequence that will produce the most amount of good for the greatest amount of people, and that will be the action we follow through with. So again, kind of simple and elegant. And the third one is this principle assumes that one person's happiness is as important as anyone else's. Now, I just finished mentioning that it's the greatest good. So not every single person will be happy by that decision. And so we try in the abstract or in theory to believe that every single person's happiness is important. But at one point, you've got to come down and say, well, the action will be this, and it will make 78% of the population happy. Well, what about the other 22%? Well, they live to fight another day. They may push back, they may, argue, and we may need to modify things. But each time we come back and modify it, the question will still be the same, right? What can we do to achieve the greatest good? So yes, in theory, every person's happiness counts, but in the practical sense, it doesn't always work out that way. Now, utilitarianism is a simple and elegant solution to secular ethics. It's basically the foundation of it, but it has some problems. And three problems, some of the most important ones. The first one is that for sure it ignores conventional religious notions, the very thing that caused it to come into being. It ignores religious beliefs and tries to come up with a secular solution that willfully ignores religious backgrounds and religious affiliations. And that can certainly upset people. There have been decisions made in the past, whether different countries, different provinces, the states, whatever, where we see decisions being made that are allegedly benefiting the greatest number of people, but kind of steamroll over religious beliefs in a very obvious way. But of course, the solution is always, but it's for the greatest good. So yes, it ignores conventional religious notions. Two, it also ignores conventional moral notions. Whatever moral status you may have had at one point, it argues or tries to argue that race or sex or sexual orientation or social class doesn't make any difference at all. But it doesn't take long to find examples where the decision looks a little questionable. You argue for the greatest good, and instead, when we look at it, it literally takes us 2 seconds to go, wait a minute, this decision really is going to impact, half the population, women, or people of color, or those who are poor. We need to be very careful. And if we're going to say that everybody matters, these decisions need to be made with these particularities in mind. But it does tend to ignore these moral notions that are based on race or sex or social class. And the third one, which may drive some people completely crazy, is the fact that utilitarianism doesn't have absolute moral rules. In other words, it's not the same thing every time. If you are going to weigh the consequences of your actions, each situation will present a unique set of circumstances that you have to now weigh out and look at the consequences of each form of action that you're going to follow through with. So there is no absolute utilitarian position other than the greatest good. Everything else is up for grabs. In other words, each specific situation is going to cause you to weigh pros and cons and say, well, if I follow A, there will be, severe consequences. If I follow B, there will be fewer severe consequences, and maybe the greater good, will be the result. Okay, let's go for plan B. So there are no absolutes such as there are in deontology, which is what we'll talk about next week. So that does sort of unnerve people because it isn't the same thing each time. It does require some thinking, but at least it shows that utilitarianism has some degree of flexibility. So that's where it really becomes useful. Okay, so our moral duty to help others is to promote also the general happiness of everyone else around us. That is important because the general happiness of everyone will then translate into a sort of a more robust and healthier and more sort of a social fabric that is alive, right? That is strong, that is supported by people. So we treat one another decently, and there's a degree of general happiness which is increasing. And of course, when that happens, society is stronger as an institution. Okay, so we want to think about what we're doing to others. So we want to be conscientious of what we're doing. So if we are thinking in a conscientious way, we are considering the other person. We are being empathetic. It goes beyond sympathetic. Sympathetic, oh, okay. But empathetic means, yeah, I see something from your point of view. And if you're going to be a utilitarian, you need to be able to think conscientiously and be able to put yourself in the position, in the shoes of that other person, and ask yourself whether that action will in fact be beneficial to them or not. Okay, utilitarianism believes that we have a moral duty to help each other. It's that simple, and that duty to help others is global. We should be able to help people around the world, whether you belong to a charitable organization, World Vision, and Christian networks and other things like that. Utilitarians believe that, yeah, we have a moral duty to do this. Because we can, we should. If it was virtually impossible for us, short of having to go to another part of the world to help out, yeah, it might be more difficult. But when there are institutions and businesses, I'm going to call World Vision not a business in the sense that, it's out to make a profit, but there is a way by which we can help others. And we simply donate a small amount of money each month that we can afford to lose or to do away with. And utilitarians say, yes, yeah, because it's there, you should. So if morality rests on an agreement between people that can help each other out, how can helping out a complete stranger promote my own interests? Well, it's actually pretty simple, because we have that feeling of being conscientious, right? Wishing to do what's right. Because we know others are suffering, because we know that there are, disaster areas around the world at any given time, because there are diseases to eradicate around the world, because of any number of things, all of these particular aspects of the world allow us to sit and be conscientious. What can I do to help? It's that simple. What can I do to increase their overall happiness? If I send even a small amount of money each month, I'm able to help them to get medicine, to build a well, to tend to animals, to make them self-sufficient, which ultimately is what most of these charitable organizations try to do, make individuals self-sufficient. But it does take startup money. And we come along and we feel conscientiously, positive about doing this because we know it's going to help. So John Stuart Mill, right, writing in the 1800s, came up with the same thing as David Hume, right? Social sentiment, conscientious feelings. Now, that has nothing to do with religion, but it has to do with us as human beings, as social animals, right? That degree of sociability is what matters when we are trying to sort of glue together our society and say, this is the way I wish to live, and I would like others to follow suit. So if you set an example, then other people see that, yeah, it is a good thing. Now, Peter Singer, we're going to talk about next week. He essentially argues exactly the same thing. What I've just said is essentially his argument. He says, look, we do care more about our family and friends. It's true. And we have rational capacities that allow us to say, okay, look, that feeling of social sentiment, that conscientious feeling, there's no reason why it has to stay within the community. If we know that other people are suffering, there's no reason why we shouldn't consider them equally. So there's no real difference between someone that is close to us and a complete stranger that we may never meet, but we know we are helping out. And again, it's not $1 billion a month. No, it could be, $20, $30 a month. That's a reasonably small amount of money. As a student, that could be a lot, I understand. But if you can afford that, Peter Singer says, yeah, any kind of surplus wealth you may have. And let's face it, as a student, surplus wealth is typically well under $100. So even $20 or $30 can be a large amount of money. But Singer and Hume and others say, look, this is what we should do because we know they suffer, because we know if we think conscientiously about them, that we can help them. We can increase their amount of happiness. And that ultimately is what we're trying to do. Okay, so morality requires of us, the very least, to care about the needs and interests of everyone else, including strangers. So our friends, our family, our community, our city, yes, of course, but also others that we may never meet, but we know they are in trouble. We know that they need our help. So at the end of the day, we just think about John Stuart Mill and that conscientious feeling of mankind, that social sentiment that extends beyond our borders and extends globally, that we're going to do something to help people on the other side of the world, people we may never meet. But that conscientious feeling is what drives us to do those particular things. So conscientious feelings, social sentiments, those are part of the moral values that we have in our heads. But our ethical behavior, right, our ethical practices include sometimes giving to charitable corporation or donations of one sort or another. And sometimes we don't even have to do that. We can help out in a soup kitchen. We can do any number of things. So that conscientious feeling, that connectedness we have with other people, that's the social fabric that we need to maintain. Because if we are constantly threatening it, eventually society will break down. Okay, so that is basically Module 2A or week 2A. At the end of all the slides, I always have key points that you can take a look at here, which I'm not going to repeat. But in this particular case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 slides. Here are the sort of the three main positive aspects of utility and 3 criticisms that you can remember these. That would be very helpful for the quiz. And then finally, utilitarianism thinks that we have a moral duty to help others. It's really that simple. So whether it's social sentiment, conscientious feelings, secular ethics, they all essentially mean the same thing. Everyone counts equally, morally speaking. So I'll be back shortly with the second half of Module 2B, which is on cultural relativism. So see you soon.